G'day there. Welcome to the Alpha Wave Trader week ahead, and looks like we might be in for a pretty interesting week. We had some pretty big news over the weekend, which I'm sure everyone has heard about, with infrastructure in Saudi Arabia being bombed, taking out some production, and oil prices spiking aggressively higher. On the open today, it's Monday morning now, 20 past 9. I am actually using delayed data on the oil prices, so it hasn't caught up with the spike in prices yet. So oil prices right now are actually up around $60. That's WTI, West Texas Intermediate crude, up around $60 on the gap up. So closed around $55 on Friday night, and we've seen a very big spike on the open. Now, with these things, look, it's often the case in the past that I've seen these sort of news events see huge volatility initially, which is often faded, and all of a sudden the market returns to normal. The oil price and the oil markets are obviously one of the biggest markets in the world. Lots of stabilization mechanisms in place and inventory on hand to help stabilize prices if necessary. If the news gets worse and they can't bring production back online for 4 weeks or more, then we may see a sustained spike in prices. But ultimately, I think things will settle down, and you probably would see that the spike in prices will look like a good selling opportunity at some point. Now, that's not right here where we are, which is right at this midpoint of this wave down, and this is a weekly chart on oil, and we've been following this along for a while now. And really, the way of analysing these waves, you're looking at the buy zone and the sell zone, as I've described to you in the past, which is the area 12.5 to 25% and 75 to 87.5%, and also the midpoint being the major areas to focus on. And you'd imagine around this point of control now, there would be a bit of resistance now that it's opened up here. But if it breaks through this point of control, and if the news gets worse, we could see a sustained rally up towards the sell zone here. And that would be around that $67 to $72 in WTI crude. So there is a case to be made now that if things do get a bit out of control there, and there is problems to come that they can't bring back online, and there is a war premium built into oil prices, and maybe positioning may be such that there's short covering, there is a chance that we are going to see quite a large spike. But I'd say there'd be plenty of resistance up in that zone. And if anything, I'd expect to see a false break of that previous high from before May. And then you'd probably see prices revert back to the downside as production is brought back online. And if the growth is still slow, there's a chance that sell-off then resumes in oil. So I'd probably say that this spike in oil prices will be pretty short-lived, but there is a chance that it really could look quite dramatic over this next few weeks. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes. I mean, if things really do go bad, if there's another attack or even worse news, look, a breakout above that $76 is going to really change the picture in oil prices. But I can't see that right now, and that's a story for another day. But for now, let's see how it can trade around this point of control. should be some resistance here, and look, prices could just gap open up at this point and find resistance straight away. But for now, we actually do have the weekly buy pivot in oil prices. So we've been following these pivots along. You'll remember when we first had the weekly sell pivot here, when prices on a weekly basis closed below the low of the highest price candle, I gave a target down to the buy zone, and we saw that move. And since then, it really has been caught in the range. So we saw a spike back to the point of control. We saw the weekly sell pivot, where I again got bearish, and we've got the attempted rally into the sell pivot candle, which failed. We got a retest of that low, and now we've had the weekly buy pivot. So that is the lowest price candle there in that move. We have a weekly close above the high of that lowest price candle. So there is a weekly buy pivot in place in oil prices at the moment. So while that's the case, the tendency is to the upside. And so I'd be waiting until we saw the weekly sell pivot before I'd get too excited that this thing was going to turn down again. So while that weekly buy pivot is in place, there may be a nice rally coming on the cards. And the perfect opportunity would be seeing the weekly sell pivot up in that sell zone of this major down wave. If you saw that, and I'll be following it along, I'd be getting pretty excited that oil prices could really turn back down. So looking at this in relation to gold, we actually got the weekly sell pivot last week, which is interesting. So there's been some weakness in gold after a very strong spike in prices on this weekly chart, and the targets I gave a long time ago, based on the earlier wave. This is a 2016 wave to the upside, and that initial wave was what I used to create the calculations of the buy and sell zones within that wave. And that's where we saw all of this price action coming, all moving back towards the point of control and finding resistance around that sell zone, and then finally breaking out. And once that happened, we could use the extensions from this wave as an area to look for resistance. So obviously the 0.618 outside the range is the area where I'm most interested to find reversals. So that area, 0.618 above this range, comes in at 1575, and you can see prices getting very close to that area. So this is a spot where you could expect to see a reaction, even back towards the top of the range, which comes in around 1375. So that is a possibility on a pullback. Also, just looking at this most recent wave to the upside, if we do the calculations of the buy and sell zones there and the point of control, you'll see that the point of control comes in around that 1375 area as well. So this trend to the upside could still see a bit of a reaction before turning back up again. So with prices seeing the weekly sell pivot, there's no reason why this can't have a bit of a pullback and still be very, very bullish. So it is about watching this weekly sell pivot unfold, and if we get the weekly buy pivot straight away, then watch out, and may just keep going. But while this weekly sell pivot is in place, I'm just happy to not be jumping into gold stocks too aggressively, and watching the ones I do have, potentially taking a little bit of profit, because it could just tread water for a bit before taking off again. And it may not pull back all the way to 1375. It's a very strong primary wave to the upside, so the buying is still going to be present. But that would be an ultimate target, I think, where it can get to on a pullback. So don't be surprised to see some weakness. But ultimately, the big picture is still very bullish. And you can see in the past when it does fall over, often it will start off, with a weekly sell pivot. You'll see here, I think the weekly sell pivot, that would be a weekly sell pivot here. And then a couple of weeks later, we got the weekly buy pivot. So you've got a bit of a range developing, and there's lots of work. And then you get a second weekly sell pivot from that next high. And it's usually the second sell pivot where I'm starting to get very interested. And then we even got a second weekly buy pivot. So at this stage, it's really looking like a range. And then finally, the third weekly sell pivot. And look at that one. That was a really big one. And even after that happened, you got the opportunity on this retracement up into the guts of that third weekly sell pivot to put a position on before the failure towards the buy zone of that wave. So the way markets turn around, they're always very difficult. You can see it even here in turning around. You've got the initial weekly sell pivot, then you do get the weekly buy pivot, and then you've got the second weekly sell pivot, and that one was the beginning of this wave to the downside. So often just acting on the first weekly sell pivot isn't the way to go. It's about biding your time until you get the signs that it really is ready to turn down, and all the short-term traders are fatigued, and that's when you start to see some really great opportunities. But that's probably enough for today. Based on the S&P 500, we've been following quite closely. We don't have a new all-time high yet, but boy, it's gotten close. And as I was saying to you last week, if you hadn't put a position on, this zone is a very interesting one where it can turn down from. But if you've waited until we get this daily sell pivot, that's when you start to get interested. And looking at this, there's potential that we could see a daily sell pivot tonight, but it hasn't happened yet. So we've got to see how this market reacts tonight. As I've said before, often these things, they get reversed pretty quickly. A lot of volatility initially, which is ultimately reversed. So we'll see what happens tonight. If it finds buying support now and really rallies, look, it could be at all-time highs tomorrow. In which case, I'd be getting worried about my view that we're ready to turn down again. So tonight's price action will be very interesting. If it does find the selling pressure, it's going to look very interesting to me about this initial wave down, an ABC rally, and then the failure. So that is still all on the cards, but it won't take too much now to negate that if it does break out to new all-time highs. So all eyes on tonight's price action in the E-mini S&P 500. All right, that's enough. I will come back with more next week.